on the panel to click in, but I can start the meeting with the opening statement. I'm Holly Stallworth. I'm the designated federal officer for the BenMAP and Benefits Methods panel. And I'd like to open this meeting by reminding our audience that we are operating under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And that means this meeting was noticed in the Federal Register. This is a panel that's chartered under FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and it's empowered by law to provide advice to the EPA administrator through the chartered SAB. And consistent with the requirements of FACA, the deliberations of this panel are conducted in public, which means that we have a public notice in the Federal Register. I'll be taking the minutes, which will be certified by the chair and posted on our website. And we have an opportunity for public comment, but we don't have any requests for public comments today. And lastly, I just wanted to note that this committee, that these panelists submitted confidential financial disclosures that were reviewed by our office, and we determined there are no conflict of interest issues for any of the panelists participating. We're being live streamed on YouTube. If you're watching YouTube, you probably found your way through our website. But if, excuse me, if not, go to, epa.gov/SAB and click on today's date. And then you'll find the YouTube link and the report that will be discussed today and today's agenda, which looks like this. Everybody knows to mute their phone, mute their computer when you're not speaking. I'm gonna give it a few minutes to take notes on who's here. We got Matt Nadell, Nick Kumanoff. Drew, I don't know if you want to wait a few more minutes. We're still expecting at least 6 or 7 or 8 others, maybe more.
Joe and Steve both just clicked in, so we're getting to 12.
We got Joe Aldi, that's great.
Yep, and Michael Kleeman, Steve Newbold.
Great.
Chris
I know
Tessel.
Enid is joining us because she emailed me this morning. We got Matt Nadell. That's great. Do we have Ling Jen? Davin Hensey? I click behind this. Michael Kleeman, thank you.
If I counted right, we have 11 panelists.
Okay. Do we have David Bale yet?
Yep.
Oh, we do? Great. Rob McConnell. He's on the West Coast. We got Lisa Robinson, Scott Spack, or Chris Tessum.
Chris is on.
Great.
I haven't seen Scott yet.
I think that's enough, Drew, if you want to get started on our agenda.
Okay, that sounds great to me too. Well, thank you all for joining, and it's great to have a nice turnout. I know people's summer schedules are challenging, so we really appreciate you making time for this. We will, for those who joined after Lisa asked her question about whether this is the last meeting, we will both see how long this discussion takes today to get through all of the remaining issues. And then by the end, whenever we end, we will also decide whether another meeting is called for. So the purpose today, just to review the agenda here, is Holly has already convened us with the formal statement. And as we don't have any requests for public comment, the agenda will be pretty straightforward, and that we will simply go through the revisions that we made since the last meeting. We've listed several of the sort of larger edits that were made in following last discussion. And so we can try to go through those specific four plus five bulleted items that are in the agenda. Sorry, it's one of them has a bunch of sub-bullets. It's like the charge questions themselves. There are 10. It's very clear, except that there are actually far more than 10. So we will go through the specific items, which I won't bother to count, but they are in everybody's agenda, and we can go through those in order. But we are not limited to just talking about those issues. And so then we will have any other business or any other miscellaneous edits that people would like to bring up. That would be fine to do that. I think it'll be most constructive if we go through the items that are listed individually in the agenda first, and then at the end we can see what other sections that we have. We also have an overarching question there about the letter to the administrator. So I hope people have had a chance to look at that. It's at least relatively short compared to the entire review. But it's important really that we ensure that we have our most important recommendations, our top level recommendations should be in that letter, so that those who don't take the time or have the time or energy to delve into the full report can find them. So that includes both the top line recommendations from the BenMAP portion, charge questions 6 through 10, as well as from the first 5. And so after we go through the individual items, I would hope we can have a kind of general discussion of whether the key recommendations have made it there. Once we've gone through the specific items and the letter to the administrator, any other miscellaneous edits, then we can close our meeting with a discussion of next steps. And at that point, we'll be able to decide whether we want to all reconvene or whether we're done. So I think if there are no other questions, if there are no questions, since I didn't actually ask for any yet, if anybody has questions, please now go ahead and ask, and otherwise then we'll go into the agenda item for the list of specific discussion points. Are there any questions at the moment? Okay, I don't see any. Welcome also to Enid and Rob, who I saw joined us while I was speaking there. So we have even a larger portion of our panel, which is terrific. Okay, so according to the agenda, these are really in numerical order, unsurprisingly. The first larger revision that was made was there was a question about using that Pete Maniloff had raised about a little more clarity on the panel's thoughts on the EPA making use of PM10 related EPI studies in addition to PM 2.5. And so Matt had kindly taken that on and revised the response to charge question 1B, which now hopefully provides that additional clarity. To me, anyway, it seems to provide that additional clarity. And I appreciated your revisions, Matt, which seemed to do the trick to my mind, but I'd be happy to hear what others thought about that. And if there's further questions or comments related to our recommendation that in cases where adequate PM 2.5 related studies were not available, that the EPA could incorporate studies using PM10.
And this is on charge question 2. Well, it's charge question 1B, but in the report, it's 2.1.B.
Thank
Which
you.
starts on page 3 of the PDF posted. Drew, I'll try to track where we are in the report with the discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, and it's helpful to point out that the numbering has that 2 in front of it in the panel.
It has a 2 in front of it. We're on page 3 of the report.
There we go.
And it'd probably be useful since Pete had raised this question. If Pete, I'm just curious if you thought that what was in there now was clear and answered your question.
Yeah, sorry, I missed exactly what page are we on, Holly?
We're on page 3 of the PDF posted on our website.
And I was referring to Pete Maniloff. I'm happy to hear from Pete
Oh.
too. But
Sorry,
was
I
referring to-
heard Adams from Analog. All right.
But your comments are welcome.
I will mute myself.
Yes, thank you for fleshing that out a bit more.
Okay, it sounds to me like we have converged on some text that we're all happy with. So thank you again to Matt for making that revision. I think we have a nice set of bolded recommendations, 2 different tiers, and then the supporting text below.
There is one question about the supporting text.
Sure.
I put a question in the document itself. This is if this is too far in the weeds for our discussion on this call, let me know. But there's a sentence in the final paragraph of the supporting text. We're talking about 1B, correct? Just to make sure that indicates, different sources of PM may have different toxicities. Sure, I think 2 paragraphs above, we say something about sort of breaking out TSP by their mass fractions, I think. And I just wonder if those 2 things are in tension. If you just break them out by mass fractions, but don't take account of their differential toxicities, you're at least missing part of the decomposition you want. So I don't know if that wants to be qualified or what, but I just flagged it in the document.
Okay, I think I understand what you've said there, Steve, and I think the earlier part, you're right, about mass is ignoring the speciation. So maybe what we could do is point out in that last paragraph, which is I think the first time we talk about speciation, that if you had data that would tell you some differential toxicity based on the composition of the aerosol, that would also prompt one to revise the above. Would that be helpful, you think?
Yeah, I think at least anything that sort of acknowledges that's sort of a 2-part problem would be satisfying to me.
Okay. I think that since we don't have the speciation data yet, that we don't, I don't think we want to change that mass-based approach, but in the future, you're right, it's a 2-part problem and we could do both if data were available.
And if I could add, I think it might be useful. I think some of what's happening here is that we just now in this last paragraph, we just say PM. And so it's following from a discussion of PM 2.5 versus 10 versus TSP. And now all of a sudden we just say PM, but this now speciation is just about PM 2.5, the different species of PM 2.5. So it's kind of like a different point. So we might need something to transition. This is now, when we're talking about PM 2.5, there's an issue about the different species that make up PM 2.5. So it's kind of like a right turn, but it's still important. So maybe just a qualifying sentence to separate that it's kind of a distinct thought.
Okay,
Would
I
that
think
help, Steve?
that sound reasonable, Steve? Yeah, okay, we got a thumbs up. Good. Okay, I think that we can and should make small edits to that final paragraph of 2.1b then, and we can change PM to PM 2.5 because that is specifically what we're really talking about and what those papers are referring to. It's not PM 10. And then we can point out this connection it's a distinct topic, but it has implications back for any use of PM 10. Okay, I don't see anybody complaining about that. Good. I think we are then in good shape on 1B. So thanks to Matt and Steve, and let me look at different window. Okay, so next question is the following run right on the next page. So 1C. So just after that paragraph we were just looking at, if you scroll down, assuming you have it open, 2.1C, we also made some substantial revisions, and in that case, the lead there was Steve, and what we were talking about here was, again, in large part in response to Pete Maniloff's comment about a little more clarity on how one would pool results. And my summary of the edits were that we both discussed some additional meta-analyses approaches that were already out there in the published literature. And then Steve revised his very useful appendices and the discussion of those that talk about quite, I think, cutting edge pooling approaches. And so we are much further along, I would say, on 1C than we were at the beginning. Steve, do you want, maybe before I open it up, do you want to add anything about what you did for 1C?
Yeah, I just add, I mean, the main things I tried to do in the edits I made here was to expand on the, what what went without saying before, included a lot of caveats. And some of those are more explicit now. And so it's meant to be pitched at the right level of preliminary, I guess, and not comprehensive. There's a final paragraph that tries to summarize, what we're trying to do with these suggestions, that in a very broad way talks about advantages and disadvantages of sort of a spectrum from just throwing all the numbers out there versus using some complicated machinery to process them into a single number. So I'll take advantage of Pete's presence, Pete Maniloff again. If I don't know if Pete's had a chance to look at this, at the risk of putting you on the spot, if you have a reaction to how far we went here and if it's far enough to at least help answer the question you posed at our previous meeting.
Yeah, again, thank you. This is helpful for us as we're good. This is, I think, sufficient and helpful and a big improvement from our perspective as we think about how well the trade-offs involved here. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, the only other thing I'd say is to go any further would, I don't know, take us into, I don't know, new work territory that is kind of beyond our scope, as I said. So
That's a good point. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, both Steve and Pete, then, for weighing in. I'll open this up to the rest of the panel. Any additional comments on our response to charge question 1.C or 1C in section 2.1D?
And Steve, you also had new edits to the appendix that is attached to this charge question, right?
Yes, and so, yeah, my comments were sort of wrapped up around this section and the appendix. I don't know if Pete wants to say any more about the appendices, but also while I'm thinking about it, Nick had good points about Appendix A in particular, and that helped me write some of the explanation there. I don't know if that stays faithful to the spirit of Nick's comments or not. So if Nick wants to say anything, that could be helpful at this point, but also, open the floor completely as well.
Nick or others? Any other comments on 1C?
I apologize. I've been having some internet stability problems, but Steve, I read the appendices that you revised.
Sorry, Nick, we got part of that, but I think you said you were having internet stability issues, which definitely seemed.
Appendices, and they look good to me. Thanks for revising them. I only caught the tail end of your question to me, but I think everything good. Thank you.
It's gonna be hard to transcript.
Yeah.
Maybe
Where
Nick
did
put his
chat?
comment in the chat. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we heard the first part of that, Nick, if you can hear me, that you were good with the appendices, but there we go. I see you're already ahead of us, putting it in the chat. Super.
Nick, also, I'm going to send you a phone number where you can participate by audio only.
Okay, thanks, Holly. That might be helpful. It looks to me like I as a sentence, I believe I put in that I accidentally bolded. We could unbold that right in the middle of that reply. Otherwise, it was just, about prior meta-analyses. Otherwise, any other comments on 1C? Otherwise, I would suggest we move on. But if there are comments, please chime in. All right, I assume that implies we're in good shape. So the next on the list is good. It's both, it's 2C. So in the document 2.2C, and Jonathan Bonacor and Chris Tessum. So Jonathan's not able to join us today, but Chris is here. And this is another one in response to one of Pete Maniloff's questions about downscaling and if the agency were to use the shared socioeconomic pathways, the SSP projections for social demographic changes. Chris, do you want to, are you willing to give us a little summary of that, or have anything to add to the general, very vague description I just gave?
Yeah, sure. I'll probably do it just with audio because I have suspicions about my internet connection.
No worries.
So basically the idea is that there isn't like any single best practice. There have been some people that have been doing this, but there's no standard. But one place we would recommend looking is the EPA has been doing some work in this area. There's something called the ICLUS model, which their goal is to do downscaling of population scenarios. It's not from the shared socioeconomic pathways, it's from the IPCC scenarios, which I think are similar, but maybe not exactly the same.
Okay, I thought those were the same thing, but I wouldn't swear to that, and maybe
Yeah, I know some IPCC scenarios are based on the shared socioeconomic pathways, but my guess is that these ones are maybe an older version that wasn't, or something like that, because I feel that they would have said something about it being related to the shared socioeconomic pathways if it was.
Okay, you're probably right. Yeah, and land use. Yeah, okay. So good. So we have I think what reads to me as a relatively clear statement that there's a lot of options out there and the community has not settled on a single one, but helpfully we can point EPA to their own colleagues who apparently have at least one highly regarded method. Does that seem, any comments from either Pete on this or any of the other panelists on this response?
I just want to say thanks. Yes. We're always hoping that there's someone who's already solved the problems and there's a well-regarded consensus. And we're talking to the ICLUS team, of course. Yeah. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, not sure this counts as solved, or maybe the problem is it's
No.
too solved and there's multiple solutions. But
Right.
great if you can work. Yeah, ICLUS would at least provide some internal consistency too. All right, I don't see anybody. I hope I'm not going too quickly here, but I don't see any other anybody waving or anything. So why don't we? This is good if we get through the larger revisions that we know about, so that we have more time to deal with any that we don't know about, and to make sure that letter to the administrator is satisfactory to everybody. So We can go on to our last point in the question in the agenda, but it's charge question 4, which has multiple subsections. So there are 4 bulleted issues or parts of the report that we highlighted in the agenda related to valuation approaches. And so it's good to see that I think everybody who was involved in these revisions is able to join us today. That's wonderful. And the first one really is this something that we as a panel decided was useful. It is not really a direct response to a question, but this overarching discussion about valuation that Lisa put together for us. And so in addition to having put it together originally, I think Lisa's taken on board some of the comments and discussion from both the last online meeting we had and follow-up emails. And maybe Lisa, if you want to just summarize a little bit, and then we'll see if anybody has comments on that overarching discussion at the beginning.
Yeah, I apologize. I spent yesterday trying to get back to Boston and didn't succeed. So I was going to compare what was in the version that we reviewed before the last meeting and this version, and just didn't have time and computer access. But I think that what is in here now is, except for some light editing, is pretty much the same as what we reviewed in May. I think the main thing that we need to talk about is actually your next point, which is the relationship between Matt's edition and some of the text that was already there. And I think both, I need to figure out how comments work in the share file, because I feel like somebody would put in some comments and they would disappear. But I think both Steve and I at different points suggested that there was some editing we could do to better integrate what Matt added with what was already there, because there's some repetition. And I have some ideas about that, but maybe we should talk about what I think is next on your agenda. Is that right? Unless there's something that any of the other panelists want to talk about, because I think first we need to talk about the substance of what Matt has added, and then we can talk about better integrating the discussion, since there's repeat between what he's added and what was originally there on qualities and what was originally there on structural modeling.
Okay, I think that does make sense, and you're right. That's the next specific item as well. And we can also, at the end of going through all of the responses to charge question 4, one of the things that you streamlined, if I'm remembering correctly, relative to an older version, which may or may not, I guess, have been the version we had last time we talked about the recommendations that go up into the letter to the administrator. And that is, of course, a topic that we'll come back to. So we can make sure to get back to that.
Actually, Drew, can I mention one thing, both because I don't know how much people are watching the email, and because there's some people on the call who aren't part of this economist group. Just a few days ago, the OECD issued the results of a study that includes willingness to pay estimates for some of our endpoints. And I think we need to add that study to the references, but it includes infertility, kidney damage, birth weight, which I don't think are on the EPA list for air pollution, but also includes asthma, which is on the list, and IQ loss. I think it's a really important study that provides improved willingness to pay estimates, and we really need to incorporate it both in the discussion that's in this cross-cutting question about developing willingness to pay estimates, but also where we later on talk about cognitive impairments and asthma.
Thank you. Okay, I hadn't seen that myself, so good to know about that.
Yeah, I sent it's online, and I sent the link to the economics group, so it's probably in your email somewhere, Drew, unless I dropped you off.
It probably is, but I was traveling too, but might have just missed it. Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. So why don't we follow your suggestion then, and we'll go to the next item on the list, which is, if you have the agenda in front of you, it's Matt's work to revise discussion of weighting of the VSL by estimates of health-related quality of life as a proxy for willingness to pay. And this is all related to the morbidity valuation section. So Matt, if you want to fill in maybe any more info there or remaining, I mean, we did as Lisa mentioned, and as Holly told us all, right, for the online, the version that we made public for the current draft, we had to remove the comments, but so that's unfortunate. But if you have comments or there are comments related to this particular issue of how to get these extra willingness to pay estimates for morbidity, yeah, then unfortunately those are lost, but anybody that made them can bring them back up. So Matt, maybe over to you for a general summary perhaps of what was done in this revision.
Yeah, the biggest change was that there's, as you mentioned, there are some studies that show how you can use estimates of VSL and combine it with estimates of HRQLs or quality weights to come up with estimates of willingness to pay for conditions where we don't currently have willingness to pay. And what's nice about this approach is that it's got kind of a nice theoretically consistent derivation that's unlike general use of qualities, which was a kind of a big concern before. So I think that where we sit with this, if I'm characterizing it correctly, is that we're still trying to sort out how high of a recommendation this should be. That I think some of us think this is more maybe tier one category where it's where you don't have a willingness to pay. This is an approach that can give you an estimate of willingness to pay. And I think some of us are still thinking it's more of a, I don't know, tier 2 or tier 3, where it's kind of not ready to be utilized as it currently stands. So I think the biggest thing is we just need to kind of figure out like what's the consensus here. I know Lisa and I have had a lot of back and forth about this. We're the two extremes. I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything to add to that, but I feel like it, maybe what might be useful in today's meeting is to figure out like what's our overall reach on this, knowing that we're not in agreement, but how do we come up with a recommendation for EPA based on that?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I would suggest. And one is I really like, I can't remember who wrote it, I guess Steve. I really like the way the paragraph on structural models is framed, because it I think makes it very clear that this is a really interesting, important approach which should be pursued, but needs more development. And I would love to take what you recommend, Matt, and merge that in is not quite the right word, because it is sort of a separate subset. It's a structural model of a type, and that it's trying to take theory and fit it with empirical estimates. But I think there's a way to do that. It would put it as this is worth more attention. I'd also like to add a few sites. The HAMA 2017 piece that I emailed to the economics subgroup that is already also cited in the report walks through this issue of whether HRQL estimates are consistent with theory, and cites a bunch of papers to basically say no, it's not, and the reasons why it's not vary depending on which author. So I think we need to back off a little bit on saying that it's theoretically consistent. I think we also need to recognize that this is something the Department of Transportation has done for years. Exactly what they do has changed over time. I should say I was one of the peer reviewers of that work, and I've also been involved in some work to try and improve on their approach. But I think we need to recognize that it's not quite as new as we think. It's something that Ted Miller developed back in the 90s, I think, and it's been around for a while. It's been criticized. The 2006 IOM report that I co-edited, we had a big discussion in that committee about whether or not to explicitly criticize the DOT approach, or instead to just write some best practice recommendations that DOT didn't adhere to. We went the best practice route. But if you read that report, which was commissioned by OMB, EPA, and a bunch of other federal agencies, you'll see that it has a bunch of recommendations about how to estimate HRQOL that are not necessarily consistent with what's done there. The other problem is that I think there's a big research agenda here. There's a lot of different ways, and I think you said this, Matt, or maybe I said it. I can't remember who wrote what, but there's number of different ways of estimating HRQL, and they're whether or not they're consistent with our notions of utility varies, there's also some real drawbacks to many of the existing studies. So I think this is one of those areas where it's a really interesting idea, but I think there's a big research agenda here. So it's not something that it's not ready for prime time. Whereas the other thing, our two top tier recommendations, the using the benefit transfer approach and doing a criteria driven review of the literature, that is ready for prime time. Many of us could do it fairly easily. The expanding the COI estimates is also something that could be done fairly easily. Looks like Mark has his hand up, so I'll shut up.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa. No, that's quite useful. And currently, you're right. All of the bold recommendations are kind of all lumped together. So we might split them into different tiers. Which, anyway, Mark, please.
Okay, can you hear me? It's my first time using this headset. So
Yep, we can hear you
works?
fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so just to where I land is I'm pretty favorably inclined towards this weighting of the VSL with the HRQL estimates. But a couple of points would be if there's problems with HRQL estimates, then there's problems with qualities, because qualities are just HRQL multiplied by duration. So we have a recommendation that EPA actually compute monetized qualities and then consider using them either as a primary benefit or as a secondary. And I think if we're okay with qualities, then it's hard to be not okay with just the HRQL indexes, which are only a part of the qualities and which do sidestep a couple of additional restrictive assumptions on preferences.
Yeah.
So one possibility might be, so we have there's two recommendations essentially. One is framed as a suggestion. That's what Matt has just written. And then that's on line 1, I think, of page 14 or 15, wherever we are. And then there's one 2 paragraphs below, originally written by Lisa, that's a recommendation. But both are using something from the quality literature, either just the HRQLs or the qualities together with monetization. I agree that there ought to be some kind of reorganization to, either, I would suggest we either put those two on the same or similar footing, or state a reason why they're not on the same or similar footing. I personally could go either way on that, but we might consider saying something like, look, when there's not suitable WTP estimates available, EPA should develop proxy measures using information from the quality literature. And here's 2 suggestions on how to do that. There's the monetized qualities, which have some advantages, some disadvantages. There's the weighting the VSL, which has some advantages. And then we decide, is that a recommendation? What tier is it? Are we saying they should use it? It should be sensitivity analysis. I think, maybe all of that, of course, would require people to reach some sort of consensus on it. Anyway, that would be my suggestion.
You know, Mark, you're making me realize that this is Holly keeps reminding us that we have to be careful about the word recommendations, and going back and looking at what we said here, I think we missed one. So the one that I wrote on monetized quality says recommends that EPA consider. So that's sort of soft, you know. Maybe that should say EPA should consider without the words recommend, and then we put what are sort of three recommendations: the monetized qualities, the using just the HRQL weights, and the other pieces of the structural benefits transfer stuff that Steve, that sort of on this. To me, they're all on the same footing. They're ways of trying to get at the non-pecuniary effects, or the non-pecuniary piece of value that's left out when we look at cost of illness estimates, and all of them have problems and need more work. And we do have in the monetized quality section, we do have, there's several unresolved challenges, blah, 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 that raise exactly the issues that you were just raising, Mark, that say we've got problems here. I don't have any problems with taking out that word recommend. I guess it's line 22 of page 15 and turning that into consider and putting it on the same footing as the structural models and the VSL partitioning. That was my mistake. I should pay more attention to where it says recommends.
Oh, I might be looking in a slightly different place. I was looking at the start of charge question 4 in the very first paragraph, which is on page 13.
Yeah, this carries over. This carries over.
Okay.
Yeah, Drew, your language that softens that last phrase makes good sense to me, but we also need to fix the text. But I think the reason we picked up the recommends in the summary recommendation is that it's not paying enough attention.
It seems like the big thing is we're saying when a willingness to pay estimate doesn't exist, and we only have a cost of illness estimate in its place, we have these three different approaches that we're saying all have pros and cons to them. The question, I think that, I don't know if I'm curious to hear from the other economists in the group, like, do we want to recommend that EPA does this, or do we want to suggest that they consider doing it? To me, that seems like where we're at. Like, is it yes, do it, or yes, consider it? My vote is that we do it. I feel like we're at a, would you rather use a lousy cost of illness estimate that we all know is bad, or would we rather use something that's an approximation to a willingness to pay, knowing that it's not perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of good? That's my stump speech.
No, thanks, Matt. I mean, it is important to I'm glad you pointed out that what we're comparing with is not the absolute how good is this and how perfect is this value, but we're either doing this or we're doing, 0 or a cost of illness or something, right? We're comparing with some other reference. Okay, I see a couple of hands, so why don't we hear from Pete Maniloff and then Steve, please.
Just one more, I won't say recommendation, I guess, request, suggestion. If you're considering not recommend, one more third possibility, I guess, could put it, is if the committee decides to suggest that we consider these approaches, then you might also, then it would be helpful to explicitly say what are the technical problems to solve or to assess as solved before we would decide that it was ready for prime time, in Lisa's words.
All right, thanks, Pete, for that comment. I'm not sure. Yeah, that would happen soon. Some of these things are long-standing issues, but it's good. It's a good way to think about it, or a good way to make the whatever comes out of this as useful as possible. How about Steve next, please?
This may have been said, but in case it hasn't, I was going to ask, at least for clarification, if recommending EPA do this in a sensitivity analysis, is that kind of an intermediate option as well?
Yes, from our perspective.
I don't see why that wouldn't be on the table. Yeah.
And that kind of puts it on deck. I mean, people can see the numbers. The agency can discuss that however it sees fit, but it's not given the, I don't know, stamp of primetime approval, I guess, if to mix metaphors there.
Right. But it's a little less vague than consider this, which, could be, okay, we got together over coffee and we considered it. We're done.
I like that a lot. But the other thing is that I think EPA can get a lot farther with this criteria-driven review of the willingness to pay literature. I've looked at a lot of these reviews. I don't know how many other people have, and we may end up with ranges, but I think but I would love to see them do that first, or maybe, all these things could be done concurrently, but we really need a better sense of how far we can go with the willingness to pay literature.
So Lisa, Nick, we'll get to you in a sec. I see your hand, but Lisa, would you consider then that amongst the options that we're discussing here, that using the criteria-driven review literature is ready for prime time already?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
It needs to be done, but I've done a lot of these myself, so I have some idea of what the workload is in the time frame, and I think there are criteria out there from previous SAB panels and work by other people, and there's existing literature reviews, so the foundation is already there. I think there's some that doing the criteria-driven review of the willingness to pay literature is something that could easily be done within a year if EPA has the, or less than that, depending on how long it takes EPA to get the resources together. And
Okay.
so, yes.
So then we would be potentially, we're not finished yet, but potentially recommending that the EPA do that as one of the options, just recommend that they do that. And secondly, that they perhaps as a sensitivity study also use the monetized qualities and the structural approaches and such. But that's sort of distinct then from the criteria-driven review of WTP.
Well, if we go back, Drew, to what you were talking about on page 13, the bolded recommendation,
Yeah.
The expanding the cost of illness estimates is a no-brainer. And maybe we should merge into that same recommendation that they should be consistent in how they value time, because that's a part of the cost of illness measure. And it comes up later. The second thing would be this willingness to pay review, which is, something that could be done, this low-hanging fruit could be done now. And then the third would be consider alternative approaches for, I can think of more technical language used, but for basically filling in the piece of willingness to pay that represents, sometimes we talk for non-fatal effects, we talk about it as pain and suffering, but it's basically the things that are not counted in the cost of illness estimates, so the non-pecuniary measures. And that third piece, the final sentence, instead of saying consider the use of monetized quality adjusted life years estimates, consider the use of I don't know what we want to say there, alternative approaches as discussed below, when willingness pay estimates are not available. And then that would encompass the VSL fractions. It would encompass monetized qualities, and it would encompass, Steve should talk a little bit about what he thinks is left out of the structural modeling. So,
Okay, so we can return to that in a moment and see if that is like what kind of language associated with that suggestion to consider those would also be strong enough to please, Matt and Mark and such. But Nick, you've been waiting patiently, so go ahead.
I think I fixed my internet problem. To just follow up on some of the comments that were made, I agree with Matt that using some kind of a rescaling of the VSL, whether it's QALYs or HRLQs, is very likely to be an improvement on cost of illness measures. Kind of like what Mark said, I think HRLQs and quality measures raise similar sets of issues, and it makes sense to consider them together. I'm unsure whether the set of weights that we have from the literature for qualities or HRLQs is sufficiently complete and credible and internally consistent with VSL measures to be ready for prime time, like Lisa was emphasizing. And so with all that in mind, and following on what the question that Pete asked, I wonder whether we could recommend as a tier 1 recommendation that EPA evaluate the viability of these approaches, qualities, and HRLQs for approximating willingness to pay when direct evidence is lacking. And we could suggest specific criteria that evaluation should address. That would be the credibility of the available weights, the completeness of the available weights for the set of health outcomes that need to be evaluated, and their internal consistency with the EPA's approach to applying VSL.
Yeah, I feel like I should shut up, but let me just say that what Pete's asking for, I've done before, and we have plenty of things we can reference. So I think what Nick is recommending, I wouldn't, at this point in this committee process, to start all over with sort of opening up a whole new issue of trying to come to agreement on criteria, maybe more than we can handle. But we can reference previous reviews, both previous SAB reviews, the IOM report that I mentioned, and some other things that are in the literature as sources for criteria. The whole benefits transfer framework is applicable here. And I'd be happy just to add a list of references for everybody.
Nick, could you just repeat what your language was? Something like recommend that EPA evaluate the viability or feasibility of these approaches. What was that? Could you just repeat that sentence?
Yeah, I think you got it. That they should evaluate feasibility of using those two approaches for approximating willingness to pay when we lack direct evidence.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the suggestion. And Lisa, thanks for the comment. Be interested to hear reactions, including from Mark and Matt. And Mark, you have your hand up, so why don't you start?
Okay, yeah, so I like Nick's suggestion. I would say, so credibility and internal consistency with how the VSL is used, I think are important. I'm not sure that completeness really is critical, because it's not necessary. It's not necessary to say, let's value everything that is currently cost of illness with this method. I mean, if it only picks up a couple of conditions that are currently cost of illness, I would still count that as a win with any of these methods. So just to wordsmith that a little bit, I would say take completeness out unless there's some other reason that I'm missing. Yeah, and then I'll just suggest, I guess I'm sort of with Matt on, I would prefer, would it be possible to say EPA should do this and then consider how to use it? Is that a recommendation? So EPA should compute some proxy measures, and then having done it, I think they would know a lot more about whether they think this is ready for prime time, or is it a sensitivity analysis, or after going through it, do they believe that, wow, this is really, we're just not comfortable using this at all? So that would be another possibility perhaps for a recommendation.
Thanks, Mark. That's an interesting nuance to consider. Matt, do you want to chime in again?
Yeah, I think this was all useful, like in that it feels like we reached a middle ground, but to me, it's not so obvious what the implications of this are now. If we now use, like, I really like Nick's language, I think that made a lot of sense, but what does it mean for EPA to assess the viability of this? Like, I don't know what the outcome of that is. It almost feels like we need another panel on trying to come up with willingness to pay where it doesn't exist. And Lisa, I knew that would get a chuckle. Like this is we're not new in suggesting this. So I'm just a little less clear on what the implications of what we're kind of seemingly agreeing to, and I think this all sounds sensible, but it's not so obvious to me. Like, I don't know, like Pete, to put you on the spot, like, is what we're saying, is this helpful? Is this like stuff that EPA you feel like you all can do and come to a conclusion based on what we're kind of suggesting?
I think if we were to do, for example, what Mark Dickey suggested, and go ahead and try to do this, then we would have some more information, or we could consult. I think EPA has looked into this in the past and not implemented that, right? That's meaningful, and maybe our assessment now would be different. I think this isn't a whole lot more prescriptive. I think what I'm hearing isn't a whole lot more prescriptive than look into it, right? But it kind of sounds like that's the consensus.
Well, but I think to Matt's point, I'm wondering whether there's sort of an equivalent of saying do a criteria-driven review. I should say we did something very similar to this for COVID, and I think I shared. There's both a paper and a journal article, but what we were doing was looking at the literature for conditions that were like COVID. So we looked at COPD, influenza, and some other respiratory effects. But so I think that if we frame this as using Nick's language, EPA should look into these different approaches, including past examples or something like that. It's hard for me to articulate exact. I'm not as good at this as Nick. Exact language in the moment, but it seems to me that what we want is EPA to do a deeper dive. And Pete's right. When the IOM book came out in 2006, there is a case study of using that Brian Hubble of EPA did. Of using QALYs to estimate air pollution health effects. But I think sort of pulling together all the things that have been done on these three areas and looking at the advantages and disadvantages, both conceptually, empirically, how much the consistency of the conceptual frameworks, the extent to which the empirical literature has tried to use these approaches, and sort of practicality, how hard would it be for EPA to further develop these approaches would make a lot of sense.
Steve, did you have a comment too? I thought I saw your hand.
Yeah, after listening to Nick and Mark's remarks, I wanted to second my own earlier suggestion to recommend doing it in doing some version of this in the sensitivity analysis. I like the idea of getting your hands dirty and seeing what happens. But I want to see that work, no matter what it turns up. So it doesn't, it's useful to see it, even if it doesn't work, at least initially. And so I guess I just feel like the easiest way to do that is to recommend putting it in a sensitivity analysis. So it does appear in the RIA in some section.
I like Steve's suggestion.
Okay, that's very tangible, and so it does make it a little stronger than just look into it, but kind of look into it, let us know what you found, but not the level of.
We could make that as detailed as we want, I guess, along the lines of what Nick suggested and what Mark said. So those ideas, I think, could be wrapped around a recommendation to do some form of sensitivity analysis as a sort of interim, hopeful ramp onto prime time or something.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I mean, the final product would be both a sensitivity analysis along with a description of, whether we thought it was credible based on this evaluation that Nick just eloquently pointed out, that I've already forgotten the wording, but credibility, etc. Not completeness, but the other things. Okay. And the,
Sounds good to me.
okay, great. The structural approach, structural models are still kind of in a separate category. Is that correct? Those are kind of, we recommend that those be studied, but that's not up to the level of the other approaches. I'm assuming that's correct, but I don't hear any other, because we use the word, say, explore.
That's that, but I think that the other approaches are that we've been talking about are in a sense, it depends on how you define structural model for us, Steve, because I've heard a lot of different ways of defining it, and these other approaches could fall under that umbrella.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, if you think of a simple enough structural model, you get something like the Kenko model. So I think of it as a spectrum, more and less complicated structures. Maybe there's, I don't know if the extreme end is reduced form or not, but it is kind of a continuum. So it'd be nice to reflect that in what we've written, at least not sow confusion about that, if there's a way to do it. I'm not sure how to wordsmith that right now, though.
Yeah, we can work out the wording later, but this would then be wrapped up. I guess that's my question is this part of the recommendation that I think we're converging on, that about the approaches like the use of monetized qualities?
Yeah, I get, okay. Last thing I'll say is I wouldn't want to write it in such a way that we restrict EPA from including something that someone might call a structural model in this sensitivity analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we have a set that we all already, I think there was no disagreement on about the going beyond COI and using criteria-driven review. And then for the sort of second part of the overall cross-cutting approach, it sounds like we have converged on what I hope is satisfactory to everybody, where we recommend that EPA do in fact try to evaluate monetize other alternative approaches such as monetized qualities, perhaps structural models, etc., and evaluating or producing a sensitivity study of the effect of including these, as well as an assessment of their credibility and limitations, etc.
Steve, what if we define structural model as any approach that combines theory with a series of different empirical estimates, and then talk about these three approaches? Well, I don't know whether there's two or three, but we talk about these different approaches as subsets of structural modeling, because then the distinction is between a primary research estimate where you go out and estimate willingness to pay for averting a non-fatal case of lung cancer or whatever, and a case where you don't have willingness to pay for a non-fatal case of whatever, but you're combining whatever you have evidence on with theory. Because I feel like all three of these approaches, the broader structural modeling that you've been talking about, the VSL fractions and the willingness to pay per quality estimates, all do that. They're all sort of mix and match theory and empirical work from different sources.
Maybe there's an umbrella way to describe these things. I would like to think of how best to do that. I'm just not sure how to. Structural versus other things means different things in different parts of the literature. I worry a little bit about tweaking somebody.
Steve,
So,
from
I don't know,
the
I'd have to
papers you were
wordsmith it.
citing, Steve, the papers you were citing, they call it structural meta-analysis or structural preference calibration. Would it make sense to use that language because you're starting with some parametric form for utility and using empirical estimates to calibrate the parameters, and that would be true whether we're talking about the quality adjustments to a VSL or whether we're talking about the Smith, Van Houten, Patanayak study that you cited.
Yeah, I like that, especially preference calibration is especially sort of idiosyncratic, specific to this part of the literature. So that helps narrow it down to something that we could use as an umbrella. That sounds good to me.
Okay, that sounds great. That would be a way to hopefully avoid confusing people about which things were and were not categorized by rearranging this discussion of what were formerly called structural models, or perhaps partially still called structural models. Good. Are there, I mean, my impression is that we have converged on something that people are happy with. Are there outstanding issues or comments to be raised on this topic? All right, that was a very useful discussion there. It was much more in depth than our previous ones, but very valuable. So yes, thanks to all who just joined in on that set of discussions. I think the next one on our agenda is a little more straightforward, and then we might return to something a little more more requiring more in-depth discussion. But the next one was Rob McConnell, who is there. Yes, I see. Is here, and it had.
Drew, before you move on, I just realized we're reps. There's one thing that there's one comment that I keep putting in here and that keeps getting deleted, but I think has never been addressed, that relates to the discussion. Sort of relates to the discussion that we just had. There is a section that on lung cancer that has a whole bunch of sorry, trying to find the paper again. It's page 20. There's a whole bunch of estimates of values, and I think at least some of those values include mortality. They're not just morbidity. And I don't know who wrote this section, and so I don't know if mortality has been taken out of those estimates. This is
sorry, where are you again, Lisa? Which page?
It's page 13.
Okay, this is
and it also doesn't have the citation for the reference to the NRC guidance, and I think that's important because they did change their guidance, and I want to make sure we're clear about which guidance document we're citing. But I don't know who worked on this, so I don't know.
Lisa, you're on page 13 of the clean version without comments.
No, I'm on page 20 of the clean version.
Page 20?
Yeah. But it relates to the discussion of evaluations. So that's why I wanted to bring it up now before we move on to the other things. You probably can't see this, but it's under question 24C. About and there's it cites a whole bunch of studies and it cites values from a whole bunch of studies, and I think some of those studies include mortality, so the numbers are going to be too high. But I didn't go back and look at them, and I don't know who actually did this.
No, I think I'm having trouble finding it, but I think I wrote that. And some of them are just cancer, so they would include mortality, like the housing market studies. I think it does say that in there. But okay.
It's not necessarily non-fatal.
Yes. I think the problem is that I think I don't care which way we go, but if we need to be very clear that these are not comparable numbers, because it seems to be making the point that these numbers are big, but they may be big in part because they include mortality.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So I think we either need to try and list which ones are just morbidity. Lung cancer is hard because most people die, but fairly quickly. But the list which ones are just mortality, and then list which ones are morbidity mixed with mortality, and very clearly say these might be too high, and then add the reference to the NRC guidance. I can send you, Mark, if you're the one who did it, I can send you the version of the NRC guidance I have if you need it.
Yeah, if you've got the newest, I guess I didn't cite it, and now I don't remember what year it's from. Sure, yeah. So I can clarify those points if that's okay.
That'd be great. And I can help. I just wasn't sure who the lead was.
Okay, great. So if we can make clear, I think you're right, Mark, it does say that, but yeah, Lisa, thanks for pointing out that those numbers are not necessarily the same as that 33 or whatever it was, 33,000. Okay, great. If you can follow up and talk to Mark about some additional numbers, that would be great. Okay, so valuation, we are, I think, good. And now back to Rob, who had kindly revised the part about response to increased exposure versus response to cessation of exposure, where we had previously, I think, just talked about that in the case of lung cancer and in response to question 4A, which is on page 16 and 17 in the clean version. Rob had made some changes. Rob, do you want to just?
I mean, maybe I'll just briefly summarize. You know, we had this question is, you know, how long should the segmented lag be? And the current EPA approach is that 80% of it takes place within the first 5 years, and then the 20% is spread out over the rest of the time. And a lot of people worked hard on sort of, you know, going through the primary studies that was the basis for this originally, and pointing out that there's little evidence that anything's changed, and that, you know, it's clear that you know, that the latency to effects extend beyond 5 years. So yeah, we recommended that the agency not make any changes, and we'd made reference to this sort of totally new approach that had been proposed in question 4C, that really makes explicit in the case of lung cancer that the assumption that that latency to the onset of disease is, I think, is essentially, you know, the assumption is that it's roughly a mirror of the time to benefits if you quit. And they, you know, based on the long latency to lung cancer, they went through a number of sort of possible scenarios for how you would estimate a benefit of disease, you know, maybe starting as late as 5 years after exposure was finished. So that's quite different from, I think that's quite contradictory to what they're proposing, what the current approach is, quite different even to what in this charge question the EPA is proposing. And there's, for lung cancer, there's there's good data on smoking and the lag, sort of lag to benefits. And smoking also has a long latency to onset of lung cancer, but it's quite clear that that for that source of particles, that the benefits are very early. You get quite a dramatic response to decreasing your risk of lung cancer if you quit smoking. So I basically took that argument and I summarized it here. I didn't do a lot of additional work. I referred them to the discussion of 4C and pointed out that I think it's probably applicable to this question and maybe generally to other outcomes. I think I didn't go and delve into the cardiovascular literature, but I bet you'd see the same issues between the latency to onset of a heart attack some bad cardiovascular outcome, that's quite long. And yet if you quit smoking, you get a pretty dramatic response, pretty dramatic reduction in the effects, sort of starting right away in the first few years. And so I just, I pointed that out, and I suggested that these are considerations for future research, and we encourage EPA to monitor the air pollution literature for studies that we really need, which is, what's the lag to benefits after exposure reduction, rather than just the latency to onset of disease. So I think it's quite an interesting research area, and we suggest that they consider this, and that they follow the literature, and maybe encourage some studies that would address this directly.
Yeah, that might be NIH, but hopefully somebody would do studies on that. Well, thank you, Rob. And I think, my impression reading this was mostly something where it wasn't clear on the earlier round what the issue was. And so this was more of rather than changing what we'd done or expanding, it was really clarifying and talking about applicability beyond lung cancer. So Rob, I thought you did a great job of making that much clearer in 4A. Doesn't seem terribly contentious to me. It seemed to read well, but if others have comments on it, the floor is all yours if anybody wants to chime in on 4A. All right, looks like people appear to be happy with your revisions, Rob. And thanks again. I like I said, I thought that they did make it quite clear and address the questions that came up.
I did. I maybe just I did a fair amount of work on 4C on this lung cancer question, and I dug through the literature and found some good examples to make the point there. I didn't do the same thing for. I think certainly the latency is going to be different for different outcomes, and the lag to benefits is likely to vary also by outcome. You pick, heart attack, stroke, asthma, they're all going to have both different latencies and different I didn't go and look at that literature. I mean, I think that would be a big job to go through that. I thought about going back and going through the cardiovascular literature and see if there was something that would be more specific, but I didn't mostly just because life's busy, rather than because I thought it wouldn't be useful.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I thought Rob did a really wonderful job with those questions. The one thing I was thinking about with the lung cancer, and it's difficult to integrate this consideration, is that there are comorbidities that develop as a consequence to cigarette smoke that kind of exacerbate kind of the development of lung cancer, such as COPD. So I don't know if it's possible to consider these comorbidities when we're thinking about latency, because we know that they have kind of a very compelling and very well validated effects in terms of the kind of the development of malignancy as well as progression. So it was just something, I didn't know if that was something we should kind of integrate into the discussion. Not so much with cardiovascular disease. But
I mean, I can't remember what I've seen that discussion in this document. I don't think it was, I'm pretty sure it wasn't in either of these questions, but I know
it wasn't. No.
There was in going through it last night, I ran across it. sort of this question of comorbidities was raised in another setting. Maybe somebody else remembers where that was, but we could maybe tie together some other charge questions by cross-referencing that.
It is mentioned in the last paragraph of the response to 4A with subgroups that have comorbidity.
Oh, yeah. I think this was your text. Edith.
Yeah. And that was, but that wasn't specifically about lung cancer.
Right.
So I don't know if we should just provide the reference with, a couple of sentences, if that would be helpful.
In the lung cancer.
In the lung cancer section, yeah.
Yeah. I think in 4C that would be a useful.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Rob, I can do that.
All right.
Thank you, Enid. Super.
Thanks.
Okay, great. I don't see anybody else with hands up to talk about 4A or 4C. So I think we are probably ready to go on.
Drew, I had a question about 4B.
Ah, okay.
Go
ahead, Holly.
So
Actually,
4B,
before we leave this discussion of adding something to lung cancer, so Eden, so it increases the comorbidities, increase the risk. Will that? I mean, these charge questions are about latency or lag, sort of the segmented lag of benefits. Do the comorbidities affect that? Do you know if they affect latency disease or?
I mean, I think at least conceptually, you would expect if the comorbidity increases the risk that it would reduce the latency period. But I would have to look and see whether anyone's really addressed that. Because usually the way the studies are structured, you're looking at the development of COPD and you're really sequencing out kind of the development of lung malignancy, the diagnosis of lung malignancy as a consequence in those who have COPD versus the smokers who don't develop COPD. And then, and there've been a lot of mechanistic studies actually over the last 10 years, kind of invoking some pathways that may explain that. But I don't know if the timing has been very specifically addressed. I would have to look at that and see.
I mean, I would be for, there might be something in the exposure literature, or I'm sorry, the smoking literature. Smoking literature I thought was quite a useful example of how to approach this question, and there might be something on.
But the interesting part of that is that once you develop COPD, your risk of developing lung cancer as a consequence of COPD remains elevated. So there are kind of certain permutations of that risk that are really interesting. But let me pull the studies and then we can see if anything is particularly relevant to that 4C question.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to work on it with you.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks both of you. It sounds like it's probably something that's useful to mention, regardless of whether there is literature related to latency, but it would also be useful to say whether that's available or lacking, that latter point. Perfect. Holly, you had something about 4B.
Lisa, on 4B, there's language right up under 2.4.B, there's language about recommending that EPA utilize more comprehensive estimates of averted cost beyond the patient's first hospital admission, moving towards a willingness to pay approach for valuing neurological and other health effects. That exact language is not in the letter to the administrator, even though we have tier one. So we want to be consistent. If every time we say this is a tier 1 recommendation, we want that in the letter to the administrator. But Lisa, was your point that this is already covered in your cross-cutting recommendation?
Yeah, so there's two sort of editorial things that I was thinking I would say for when we're not all on the call, but let me just mention them. One is we're not one doesn't get to your point, Holly, but I think I might as well mention since I've written them down in the same place. Sometimes when we're talking about the TSD, we talk about it as a proposed approach, but it's an actual approach. My understanding is that the TSD describes what EPA has been doing, so we need to make sure we draft that language proposed. And the second is the recommendation that we expand the cost of illness estimates. That's comes from that cross-cutting stuff at the very beginning under question 4. We're not consistent in places where we make a specific recommendation about expanding the cost of illness approach, of being clear that it fits under that recommendation we've already made. It's not a new recommendation.
Right. So maybe you could work with me and we could edit this. So
yeah,
so it's not
I marked,
stated as, okay.
Yeah, I was marking them on my hard copy as I was going, but
Okay. So if something says tier 1 in the text, we want it to be in the letter to the administrator, or we need to make some edits. Sounds like we could just make some edits to that.
Holly, this is a process question for you, I think, because the one way of handling the fact that, as we talk about specific health outcomes, we say EPA should expand their cost of illness estimates to include X, Y, or Z. Does that not then end up as a bolded recommendation because already under the umbrella recommendation at the very beginning? Or do we need to repeat it and just say, for lung cancer, asthma, or whatever it is, EPA should use an expanded measure and just repeat it as being part of it?
I think we can repeat it, but don't state it as though it's brand new when you've already got the cross-cutting recommendation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and in the letter we had, but I believe the language was still something about they were the recommendations we wanted to highlight, but not necessarily the only ones in the
right
in the document.
Okay.
Pete Manilow, please.
Just to confirm what Lisa said, the TSD describes our current practice.
Great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, maybe we can. I'm sure Holly, in her wisdom of having a lot of experience making SAB reports, can find a way to avoid language that is inconsistent between the letter and the recommendation. So I think we could solve that. But thanks for raising that, Holly, for 4B. That's it's kind of a sub bullet currently, so we should make sure that that's all harmonized. Okay, I think we could go to 4J. And this is a section where Joe had revised this after we had some discussions about the need to consistently consider VSL and income elasticity over time. So maybe, Joe, you could just give us a brief summary of changes to 4J.
Great. Thanks, Drew. So I think there's 4 major points we make here. First, we recommend adjusting the income elasticity to 1.0. In the past, it had been 0.4, and our assessment of the literature is 1.0 is a good representation of where the literature is today. Second, that we believe that we should be adjusting when we apply it to the VSL. That is not part of our charge. When we apply to the VSL, we should recognize that those VSL studies that serve as the basis for the number EPA currently uses reflect measures of income from a long time in the past. And in fact, we had an RA go back and look into the 26 studies underlying the EPA VSL. The average year of the income data used for estimating the willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk in those studies is 1978. So if we are going to make an adjustment for income, we believe that we shouldn't be doing it in what has been an arbitrary but varying date in past EPA practice, which has been to go back to 1990 or go back to 2000. We think you should go back to the year in which the data that were collected for income were used then to estimate the income risk trade-off in those studies. This gets to the 4th point in just a moment, but we should be doing a consistent way of doing that. So how we're then applying the VSL in the future would reflect an income adjustment going back to 1978, so long as we're using the current set of studies for EPA's VSL. The third point when we're looking forward is to think through what's the appropriate measure of income for making the adjustment. And we put forward a recommendation for consistency, recognizing that there are other forecasts of income being used in BenMAP, and for that matter, in other parts of the IRA, whether it's on the cost side, whether it's on other measures beyond BenMAP, such as the social cost of carbon. We recommend being consistent in the income forecast that's being applied when looking out into the future to estimate the benefits. The fourth point is when we take our first 3 points and apply it to the current set of VSLs, you actually generate a measure today that would be double what is posted online for EPA's VSL. And what it signals to us is, and where we have a reservation, is that we think best practice reflecting recent literature says, here's how we should adjust for income for the VSL. And we're applying it to a very dated literature for papers published in the 70s, 80s, and a couple at the very beginning of the 1990s. And so our fourth recommendation is that you apply what we think is current best practice for the income elasticity of the VSL after EPA has updated the VSL. And so right now we have language saying that we, I want to make sure I get it right. We are recommending that EPA simultaneously update the VSL to reflect current best practice in the academic literature. That's what we have right below 24J on page 27. I think that's a little different than the language we have up front in the letter to the administrator. I think the language up front is a little bit softer than that. It doesn't actually say we recommend you update the VSL as well. I think, let me pull that language up here real quick.
It's number six in the letter to the administrator.
Thank you, Holly.
No, you have it.
So yes, so here we say we emphasize the importance of EPA simultaneously updating the underlying VSL estimate. I think it's important to emphasize the importance. I think we could also recommend. I think would be a bit of a stronger language there. So those are our 4 main points. The one other thing I'd say about what we've written is that when we go through and illustrate the calculation, that if we take our recommended best practice on adjusting for income and apply it to the current set of VSLs, you get a number like 22 million for a VSL for today, as opposed to the current value of a little bit over 10 million for EPA. That's in a bit kind of buried on, I think, page 29. And I think it may be stronger to get the point across to put this right beneath the bolded text on page 27, if I have my page numbers right. Yeah, page 27 is where we begin to 24J. I think it may make sense for us to move up some of that discussion to sort of illustrate, here's what we think best practice is, but applied to the current VSL, we think it's just a fundamental change of the VSL, more than doubles how EPA values mortality risk. And that may be the right outcome. But as we've talked about from the very beginning, that's not part of our charge to do that. And we think that it would make sense given, as we've talked about previously, the long history of SABs evaluating EPA on the VSL, that we actually think like EPA needs to just update that level of the VSL, and that within would be appropriate for applying our guidance on the income elasticity.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So I think this is much more clearly described, and it's great that you had somebody who could look through all these studies and figure out that they're indeed on average, 45 years ago. That was, yeah, I was surprised at that too. I always think of the date that EPA did the review and really did not realize that. Good. So we have a suggestion to potentially rearrange a paragraph of text. I don't see any real issue with that down below, but also this idea, I can't remember exactly who put that language in the letter to the administrator, and I that might have been me putting in emphasize the importance, because
That was you.
afraid of, was it?
Yes.
Okay, so I think I was kind of wary of the panel recommending something that we weren't charged to recommend, but if people want to do that, that's that would be fine. I think it's essentially trying to get that same point across. So I'm okay with that. Any of the other panelists have thoughts on that specific language or any of the changes that Joe just described for 4J?
I thought Joe did a terrific job of merging together his thoughts and my thoughts, and I'm pleased with where this ended up. There is one small inconsistency that is that I wanted to mention in the text. We talk about the fact that you should be calculating if you calculate the income elasticity using a different income measure than you use in applying the income elasticity. So if you use, for example, GDP growth to apply the elasticity, but you use earned income to calculate the elasticity, you're not going to get it quite right. And so I think what we wrote in the text, I can't remember how much of this was Joe and how much of this was me, but was that that there should be some thinking about the consistency between the income measure used in these adjustments and the way in which the elasticities were calculated. So I think it's actually a three-way comparison. You might be using measures of income growth in other places in the analysis, and you need to be clear about whether they're the same or different from what you're using for the income elasticity, and the consistency between the income estimate you use in applying the elasticity and the way the elasticity was originally calculated. And I think this is something just where the communication needs to be clear, because the word income just covers too many different measures.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable issue to go back and maybe look again and just make sure that issue is as clear as it can be. That doesn't sound contentious. How about Matt, please?
Yeah, I agree that I think Joe did a great job kind of summarizing this and putting this together. My only comment is about the recommendation of EPA updating the VSL estimate and using best practices. And I guess my question is, like we're going back and suggesting that they repeat some of those hedonic wage estimates, but just using more current data, so they get a more modern VSL. And that's now, is that what we're suggesting? I mean, and is that something that's, within the confines of like what EPA can do?
I think we're suggesting that there are papers published since 1991, and they should look at those papers.
The newer papers use the Sequoia, and the older papers use to estimate the risk of job-related deaths. And the older paper use other data sources. So part of it is just that the data is much better, but we also know a lot more about how to do. Kip and others know a lot more about how to do a good hedonic wage study because they've been doing it for so long. So the newer estimates, I think, have a lot more credibility.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like we're asking EPA to go out and work out primary research to determine what it is, but use like Lisa sent us, what other agencies are doing, and they're relying on the more modern peer-reviewed literature.
Drew, your comment does raise a question, though. EPA has had, they're probably, since EPA developed those estimates in 1990, or 1992, 1993, they have had 6 or 7 different SAB and panels comment on their VSL approach. Some of them have been the Council on Clean Air Compliance, which looked at the Section 812 studies. Some of them have been the economics, whatever it is, EAC of the SAB. And some of them have been comments in the context of doing some things like thinking about arsenic. So EPA has a host of recommendations from expert panels to sort through. And I'm wondering whether we should explicitly mention that in here. Because those expert panels have not necessarily agreed with each other, I don't think we want to just tell EPA to blindly do what all of these gazillion panels told them to do. But it seems to me that we should explicitly recognize that EPA's gotten a lot of advice on this, and maybe it's time to just go ahead and do it.
I think EPA needs to do a panel, Lisa.
Another one?
Yep.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
And honestly, I think EPA wants to do another panel. I'll speak. I'll say that Pete doesn't need to chime in here. That's where I think things are at the agency.
When we
Oh.
recommend that EPA updates the 26 studies, I mean, would that be a place where we could naturally say this has been recommended several times before and cite each of the prior panels that made that exact recommendation to strengthen that specifically?
I mean, we can say you've been told before you need to update it. Most recently, it was in the Economic Guidelines panel of 2020. So I think we could say that, but I think I think for EPA to come out with a new VSL, they recognize it needs to go through some kind of review, right? And the usual process is this. The social cost of carbon was a bit of a different animal for a number of reasons, but this is the usual way EPA gets a review of something that they think is an important update of their application of the academic literature to their work. So I think the idea of saying just go do it, I think they're going to want to have the blessing of a peer review, and I think it's this mechanism.
My concern, and I just lost the EPA folks on my screen, but so I'm trying to look at them. But my concern is that this is constant churning. In 2011, the panel gave them the VSL panel gave them some very specific recommendations. EPA tried to follow those recommendations, presented it to another VSL panel. 2017, that panel gave them a different set of recommendations. And so I feel like part of why we don't have an updated EPA VSL is because each of these panels doesn't necessarily build on what the panel before did, because it's different people and they have different opinions. So there's this constant churning, and that the VSL never gets updated.
We should recommend that EPA gets the right people for the next panel.
Ooh, Joe. Joe's volunteering.
Or maybe the interagency working group can do this for across all of the government and have it done by, once and for all for everybody, so that they're all consistent. Probably too much to ask. Okay. Well, I think that the kind of more concrete suggestion is maybe where Nick suggested when we talk about the review that's so out of date now, that we point out that this request for an update is very consistent with results from several other panels that Lisa just mentioned, without specifically saying exactly what those recommended. Pete Maniloff.
I just want to say thanks. I think it's clear that the panel, at least the econ parts of the panel, think that this is really important, and we have put some boundaries on the panel's charge, and I want to thank y'all for thinking hard about that while respecting the boundaries of the charge. That's all.
Appreciate that. Okay, so we might, let's see. But the other thing I was going to say was about the recommendation, but I feel as if we might generally all be in consensus about this. Are there any other issues that anybody wants to raise related to 4J? Okay, my suggestion then would be we are a little over halfway through our 3 hours. So what I'm thinking we might do is, since we've gone with this one, we have completed all of the items that we had identified as rather larger revisions. So I would suggest that we take a 5-minute break, and anybody who wants to, go to the restroom or get a cup of coffee or whatever can do so. Anybody that has extra free time, think about the letter to the administrator and or any additional minor edits that you want to raise. And then when we reconvene in 5 minutes, so it's just almost exactly 45 after the hour. The hour will vary depending on where you're sitting, but we'll return then at 10 till, and we can first see if there are any specific other issues anybody wants to raise. And then as soon as we've cleared all of those specifics, we can focus the rest of our discussion on the letter, including, for example, the recommendation related to VSL here, and maybe making that stronger rather than emphasizing the importance of putting recommend in there, et cetera, and the revision to that cross-cutting one that we talked about previously. Any objections? No? Okay, good. So 1/4 till. So we'll see you all at 10 till and enjoy your break. Okay, we are hopefully all back. Home stretch here. Good. So a little hard to tell if everybody's actually back, but hopefully everybody is back. I see a few video screens again, and good. Okay, it looks like pretty much everybody is here. So we had on the agenda other miscellaneous edits to be addressed. And I think before we go to the top level recommendations to the administrator, we should see if any of the panelists do have any other miscellaneous edits either made since the last version that you would like to see what the rest of the panel thinks of, or additional edits that you think should be made going forward. So I would just open the floor to anybody who has anything beyond the points we already suggested. Let's start with Michael Kleeman, please.
Hi. So I was just rereading the letter, the top level letter, the one that lists all the tier 1 recommendations. And in terms of the software itself, we had discussed previously the concept that we should maintain both versions of BenMAP until all of the functionality in the desktop version is available in the web version. But I didn't really see that a sentence summarizing that thought here in the main part, the front part of the letter. Did I just miss it, or did that not quite make it yet?
I thought that was there, so let me see if that is.
I was just reading it quickly, so it's been a
Okay.
really hectic week, so I haven't really done my homework as well as I should have. But
I don't see it in there in the letter.
Okay.
yeah, just one sentence to that effect, I think, would capture that sentiment. I think would be valuable.
Yeah, I was under the impression that was in there, and like you two, I can't actually find that at the moment. So I think that maybe was in there at one point and didn't last. So thank you for bringing that up, Michael. I think that should go back. I totally agree with that. Oh, wait. Okay, so I think what I was thinking of is in the clean version. Oh, there's no numbers. Anyway, the first page of the letter to the administrator, the last paragraph, about halfway through on line 34. Furthermore, we note prior versions.
Oh, yeah. There it is.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. But Michael, we could certainly edit that sentence if that doesn't fully fit the point that I think we're both trying to get across there.
This is that parallel construction problem.
Michael, you can take your time and look at that if you like, and get back to us if further edits are needed on that sentence there on BenMAP at the end of the first page. But at the moment, does anybody else have other edits related to the main document? Lisa and then Matt, please.
On the losing track of pages, I guess it's the second page where the list of recommendations to the summary of the list of tier 1 recommendations is, I think, I don't know who worked on the part of the response that led to the recommendation item 8. But it seems to me that given the discussion of the VSL estimates that Joe was just talking about, that I don't know whether that recommendation 8 needs to be dropped or edited, but it seems like we need to make it fit in a little bit better with what now is the discussion of income elasticity and the need to update the VSL estimates.
Lisa, I think I worked on not the language of that recommendation 8, but the text that motivated it. What is it that seems inconsistent? I like the idea of a little bit of redundancy between 8 and what we'd already said about updating the VSL, partly because if the EPA were to determine that updating the VSL is going to be out of scope and not something they want to do in response to our recommendations, they could still address it in the context of uncertainty, which is within scope.
Yeah, I guess I have two reactions to that, Nick. I understand that point. But the first is that in my experience, most of the uncertainty in estimating air pollution benefits is actually the EPI functions, not the VSL. So it seemed like if we're going to talk about uncertainty and the sort of high-level summary recommendations, we should be talking about uncertainty in the EPI literature, not just uncertainty in the VSL, because the uncertainty in the EPI literature usually is substantially larger. So that's point number one. It just has to do with balance. I think the economists have been driving a lot of the discussion here, and we need to remember that this is also about the epidemiological literature, and there's tons of uncertainty there. The second point is that I think I don't have problems with the idea that we should do some uncertainty analysis of the VSL. I just think the language needs some massaging to clarify the point that you just made, which is regardless of whether EPA continue, one way, I guess, of dealing with this is to say that to the extent that EPA keeps using its current estimates, it should also do uncertainty analysis that reflects other estimates in the literature. And you could cite what DOT and HHS do. You could cite KIP's publication bias adjusted estimates. It's some way of sort of fitting together the old and the new in terms of making that recommendation and maybe going beyond what's in the existing guidelines.
I see. So a preface that would say, regardless of what distribution of estimates is used to construct the VSL point estimate, this kind of uncertainty analysis would be useful.
Yeah, well, yeah. How about something like, if regardless of whether EPA continues to use the VSL estimates described in its guidelines or moves to a new approach, assessment of uncertainty in the VSL estimates is, you're better at this wordsmithing on the its old estimates. It should do uncertainty analysis pulling estimates from the newer literature. So that's one way of dealing with that. But then also the point about got to get the EPI stuff in there, because when the work, at least that I've done, the uncertainties in the EPI literature just swamp the uncertainties in the VSL, and ignoring that is problematic, I think.
Well, I think what we were trying to get across here is that currently something like BenMAP has uncertainty only in the EPI functions. And so it needs to expand to include other sources of uncertainty, such as VSL. But I think we're talking about the underlying section of text rather than the recommendation here. And then it does seem to make sense to me to make it clear to the reader that this discussion of including uncertainty in the VSL applies whether or not the VSL is updated. That's relevant either way.
I thought they had uncertainty analysis of the income elasticity and some other things already in there. No?
Well, in the TSD, perhaps. I think they do, but in BenMAP, no. So you're right. This is sort of relating more specifically to the TSD. So some of that is in there, but not. I think the point of this was that they didn't have that so much for the VSL.
Yeah, because most of their RIAs is a standard uncertainty analysis that includes uncertainty. It talks qualitatively about the uncertainty in the VSL, and also has some quantitative estimates that I think are maybe income elasticity. It used to be age until they got in trouble for that. So just clarify referring to it will help.
This was based on our response to the question about what other areas of uncertainty should be considered that aren't already being considered. But I thought the language you suggested a couple of minutes ago, Lisa, was a really good addition.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that makes sense. But that's why, since it's additional, is why this comes out as a recommendation, not to neglect EPI. Matt?
I have a question about, in general, the recommendations in the letter to the administrator. And are they supposed to be essentially verbatim from what's in the main document, or are we trying to to paraphrase them a little bit? And the reason I ask is it seems like there's some things that are missing in the letter to the administrator that are in the body. So I'm just wondering if that was an oversight or that's on intentional.
I think that was for the sake of brevity, that there's some introductory and closing information, and we only have 3 pages. But Holly, maybe you could take that question about whether they should verbatim match.
When we go through quality review with the chartered SAB, we get dinged for inconsistency. As long as we're consistent, I think we can be consistent without having the exact word verbatim quote there. I would prefer a shorter, more readable version of these long recommendations, because it is the letter to the administrator. It's more the Reader's Digest version of the whole report.
Because then I see a couple of inconsistencies, some things that are listed in the body.
That's what we wanted, exactly what we wanted to talk about today. So you tell us what they are, and we'll get them fixed.
Yeah, I mean, the one, let me jump, is looking at recommendation 1, the second one, broaden the minimum criteria to include reduced form effects. But then that's the other thing that was tier 1 was to also recommend using studies that had estimated effective TSP or PM10 and to scale those to get PM 2.5. That was one thing that popped out to me.
Okay.
Obviously, we will update our discussion on willingness to pay and recommending the sensitivity analysis that we discussed. Also, and the other one that I noticed that was a tier 1 that didn't show up here was the idea of incorporating studies on labor productivity and human capital.
Yeah, I did notice that one.
Yeah, and that one wasn't in this list.
Right, I did notice that was also missing from this list.
Yeah. Those are the ones that jumped out, but I was just kind of looking at the ones that I've spent more time working on there.
No,
I don't know if there were others.
Yeah, we need to get that fixed.
Well, is it a requirement to have all of our tier 1 here, or?
Well, I think if we don't have all the tier 1 recommendations in the letter to the administrator, my fear is we'll get dinged for inconsistency. It's a judgment call.
Yeah, the letter currently says we include numerous recommendations, but we'd like to highlight the following.
Yeah, okay.
So I did not think we were necessarily trying to have every one. However, we did manage to work so hard to keep it brief that it is closer to 2.5 than 3 pages. So I also wouldn't object to adding a little bit if things are particularly important. Can I just also, it seems like, given that we're talking about the letter, that there were no other, I just want to make sure we didn't miss anybody who wanted to raise other editorial points in the main report. Okay, so let's continue to focus on we're up to the penultimate agenda item here, other than talking about next steps, is going over the bullet points of the letter. So yeah, so something like adding labor productivity, that was a relatively discrete and short recommendation. I think we could certainly put that in. Some of these, some of the recommendations, if you go back to the bold type, it was quite long. And so I did try to paraphrase sometimes and just get the main point across, so that it would take up less room. But labor, we could certainly add that, for example, and the use of, we could just add a number 3 there to that opening list about TSB and PM10. That would, neither of those would probably take more than a line.
Right.
So yes, why don't we?
And it looks like Michael Kleeman just sent us a modification to the sentence in the letter. So thank you, Michael.
Oh, super. Yeah.
I cut and pasted it and emailed it to myself because I actually don't have a recording of the Zoom. But I've got it. Thank you.
Okay. Others have thoughts about, so I guess we've had this suggestion from Joe that in line, shoot, I moved it slightly too far over on my screen. 23 and 24, instead of saying we emphasize the importance of EPA simultaneously updating the underlying VSL estimate, we have a stronger language such as we recommend that EPA simultaneously update. Okay, everybody, I don't see any objections to that. And then we had discussed earlier that we will revise the recommendation based on the overarching valuation section introduction to get that. It's a version of, I think, a version of that. Yes, that's number 9.
Yes.
So we
Just the last phrase needs to be the one that consider the use of needs to be expanded to cover all these different approaches we were talking about.
Right. Okay. So we keep the recommendation up through the semicolon, pretty much as is straightforward. And then we talked about this language of that last phrase where we would talk about structural. Anyway, we had a term.
Reference calibration.
Thank you. Okay. And that we would recommend that EPA use that approach, and including provision of results as a sensitivity study, including.
How about explore alternative approaches to preference calibration and apply these approaches in sensitivity analysis or something like that?
Yeah, something like that sounds good. Right. And then in the text, we can, underneath it, it gives detail about, we want some understanding of what the credibility is of the different estimates and if they've been weighted by credibility. Good. Okay. Other suggestions, recommendations, comments about so there are 9, just so you all know this, I presume, but there are these 9 here about the TSD, and then there's a bunch of text about the BenMAP section of the report as well. So 6 through 10 also, we could talk about any comments people have on any of the priority recommendations that go into the letter.
Drew, I noticed in the penultimate paragraph, we recommend that BenMAP be reviewed about every 5 years. That was a tier 3 recommendation. So if we want to be consistent and only have tier 1 recommendations in the letter, that wouldn't belong here.
Okay. Good point. And it wouldn't be lost since it's still in the underlying report. Right. Okay. So I have no objection to moving that if everybody else is okay with that. That also gives us a little more room to add a couple of the missing things from the other section. Thanks, Holly. Well, either people are tired of being on the Zoom, or people are pretty happy with the letter to the administrator, or both. Any other comments about the letter or anything else here? Are we should we move on? Well, looks like people are good. So if I go back to the agenda, we are almost a half an hour early, which is lovely. How often does that happen on a meeting? To the last item, which is next steps. So we had several, I'm sure that Holly will do her usual wonderful job of starting to put together all of the minutes. And that will include, and I'll look those over and we'll get those out to you, but that will include some of the small issues we talked about. I think people can remember, Enid was going to look into the lung cancer and the comorbidities, and Lisa was going to talk to send some documents over. Now I'm going to have to go back to the minutes to remember what that was about, but I do remember a few people had specific minor things they were going to do.
I sent Mark the NRC links in the chats, so.
That's it, the NRC. Thank you. Okay,
That
great.
one's done. You can check that off your list.
All right, good. So we don't even have to follow up on those things. It sounds to me then, and I guess I would like to hear what Holly and the panel think, that our remaining edits then are relatively small, that our most in-depth discussion was there about that revision to the start of the overarching section on valuation, where we had a good in-depth discussion about the level of, ready for prime time, as it were, for these alternate approaches, but we came to kind of a mutual agreement. So with that understanding, then we might be in good shape to make the minor edits from here on and finish up. Holly, does that sound reasonable to
Yeah,
you?
I wonder if we could hear from the panelists, those who are volunteering for specific revisions, like Nick Kumanoff, you had some great language for question 4. If those who have specific edits in mind, I wonder if you could just tell us what you could do for us on this to get to the finish line here.
Well,
So,
about that, can you tell us, Holly, what is the process from here? I mean, is there a point where we all panelists review the whole report before it gets back?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so the purpose of what we wanted to do today is make sure we have agreement on the top level recommendations to the administrator. And from what I'm hearing is you do, with the edits discussed today. And that's not to say this thing won't go through further editing on, small editorial things, but the major recommendations is what we wanted to hear consensus on. So yes, everyone will get a shot at reviewing the final version, and then it has to go through editing within our office, mostly for format. And then it goes to the chartered SAB for quality review, where Tom Armitage is the DFO for the chartered SAB, and he will work with the chair, currently Allison Cullen, to assign lead reviewers for this. And it'll be discussed in a future face-to-face or video conference meeting.
By the full SAB. So the process is that each of us who have volunteered or want to edit specific sections, go ahead and do that. Then you tell us that there's a final version for all of us to review, and we read through it. Then, assuming there's not any serious disagreements, you guys edit it and send it to the full SAB.
Correct. Thank you.
And Holly, we continue working with the master version 2 that
Yeah,
was linked
well,
in-
now it's called version 3
Ah,
on SharePoint. Yeah, it's
makes
version
sense.
3. I'll send out that link. I go ahead.
I just sent to the economics subgroup possible draft revision to the HRQL and quali section that's on page 15 currently. I thought maybe people could either throw it in the garbage or react to it or edit it before putting it in the master file, because that was such a significant discussion.
Right. That's great.
So feel free to throw that away or edit it in any way. I just decided to make a start on it. And then the other thing in terms of minor edits is I'll take a look at the fatal versus non-fatal thing in the lung cancer section.
That'd be great.
Holly, can we have some sort of agreement though about how we're using track changes and how we're dealing with comments? Because I feel like, I would go back into the document and I think sometimes people were accepting changes or deleting comments and it got hard to figure out what happened with things.
I think when a sentence gets deleted and there was a comment attached to that sentence, the comment goes away too.
Yeah, but I don't know. I find the SharePoint software really frustrating, but maybe you could come up with some rules about how, what we as panelists, should be accepting.
Well, it should be easier from here on out because we're talking about a limited number of edits.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we had asked everybody to use the what is it called? Suggesting, where it does track your changes.
Yeah, the problem was that I would go back in and I would see that a comment that I had written would be deleted, but there wouldn't be any response to it. So I didn't know whether it got
I don't
deleted.
know. I may have done that inadvertently, Lisa. I think a couple of times I responded to your comments and I may have deleted it, but
Yeah,
it's not intentional.
yeah. If we all can agree that we won't delete the comments, we'll just say either,
We won't delete the comments.
either Lisa, it's a stupid
It
comment.
should be easier. We're starting with a new clean version 3. And I think this is an easier set of changes ahead of us than behind us.
Great.
Yeah, I think other than that section that Mark has just gotten started on, they would be quite minor through virtually everywhere else. I see Matt's hand up as well, please.
Yeah, and to this last point, I think that like Mark said, if we just kind of work on it internally, not in the master doc, then we'll keep comments in there. No one will accept things, and then hopefully we kind of agree on it before we insert it in the big doc. What I was going to say is that I think there's a little tweak in editing to 1B on when scaling TSP to PM10 and transitioning to the species. I can take that and I'll maybe run it by Rob, since I know Rob originally helped, on that species section. And then I can add a couple of things to the letter to the administrator that I saw that maybe weren't consistent.
We're missing, right?
Yeah, that we're missing.
Great.
Thanks, Matt. That'd be perfect. Okay, so we have Mark, we have Matt. Lisa, you've sent those materials via chat, but I don't remember if you had other.
Yeah, I mean, there's places where there's either consistency issues that I can just flag, like on how we talk about the different income measures and the question income elasticity, and then I can look at what Mark did on the HRQL stuff. If there's other things that people want me to do, I'm happy to help. Oh, I want to add, and I'd like to add some references to the HRQL. I mean, whatever we're calling it, the preference calibration section now, but I can do that easily.
And would you be the one to add the new OECD willingness to pay values somewhere?
I think that's just a sentence, but I can put it in.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not anything difficult, I don't think.
Okay, and I think, right, Enid has something about the comorbidities. Nick had some nice language also on that same section with that Mark's talking about in the HRQLs. Good, and then I think Rob and Chris, your sections on the SSPs and latency in the other order, I was about to say respectively, but I got them backwards. People were happy with, so I don't think there's any specific tasks there. Holly, I think that's all the things that I remember that were very specific points.
So Drew, quickly, I'll send a new sort of second paragraph under 4J that pulls
That's
up
right. You're gonna rearrange.
that illustration of why we think applying our best practices on the income last history to the old VSL is problematic, to make that more concrete and focused at the top of that subsection.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I forgot. Just that slipped my mind for the moment, but I think that was a good suggestion too, to bring that up front. And we will change the language in the recommendation in the letter as agreed. So that one, I think you don't have to do anything. That's easy. Super. Okay. Well, it sounds to me like we have a pretty agreed a group that's happy with things. Steve, I think people are happy now with the appendices, and so your future work on that is for some future paper rather than for the panel. It's a really nice thing, but as you pointed out, taking that further would go beyond this. But I hope you do continue that. It's really interesting stuff, and I think you're on all of these subgroup emails with those who are interested in this quali HRQL, etc.
So Drew, I'll listen to the tape and go through all the to-do items and send out an email. I didn't take good notes on this because I was trying to listen for substance.
All right.
I can listen to the YouTube tape and make sure we have a complete list of follow-up items.
Super. Okay, and then it sounds like how about for timing, Holly? End of the month to get these last
Yes.
in?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, so that gives everybody a couple more weeks, and then we will, I guess, get this back to Holly's office, and so that we can get it off to the SAB. But it sounds like within this team, we can continue to have the economic subgroup, exchange emails, and that was the most in-depth discussion we had here. So that one I think is the only one that's beyond minor going forward. We could, if it proves to be useful, I'm sure we could have another teleconference or a Zoom meeting or something to talk amongst ourselves. But if we can finish that up by email, I think we'll be fine there too. And given that was the only kind of more major issue, and we seem to reach a consensus after all of our discussions, it seems we do not probably need to have this panel have another meeting before this goes to the SAB.
Once it does go to the SAB for quality review, it's very nice to have some panelists listen in on that and be prepared to respond to a question if something comes up. So I'll certainly let that date and time be known for the panel. It's just nice to have a little bit of backup for Drew, because Drew will present this report to the chartered SAB, and it's nice to have it would be nice to have a few of you online when that happens.
I wanted to say thank you, though, to Drew and Holly for doing a great job of running this panel. I think the fact that we are actually finishing up early and that we seem to have reached closure on so much of this, I mean, you guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all my fellow panelists. But that was great.
Hey, Lisa, I want to agree with that too. Holly specifically is such a great DFO, and we're lucky to have her. And Drew, wonderful chair, great panel. I'm so happy to see this all come together so smoothly. So Lisa is 100% right.
Well, I think it's been a great group to work with, and it's been a pleasure to get to know some people I didn't know before and see colleagues that I did know before as well. So I guess we are set, right? All right. So since you formally opened, Holly, maybe I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. I really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch by email. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.